Welcome back. In the last video we talked about the progress and the need for artificial blood. We're going to talk about in this topic, or in this video, is actually something completely unrelated. It is plants. So I'll read the actual syllabus dot point. Describe current theories about the processes responsible for the movement of materials through plants in Xylem and Phloem. So what I've done, I've actually put this into two short videos. The first one I talk about Xylem. So Xylem is responsible for the transport of water. So I'll go over this one first, and I'll do Phloem next, but it's for transport of water. So what I have here is I've got you actually call it a U-tube. So that is a U-tube. And what this is, you have two parts, and you have equal amounts of water on each end, and you have a semi-permeable membrane. But to begin with, this is actually locked, so it's closed. And you have more solid on the one side than on the other side. Let's remember what osmosis was. Osmosis was water movement, so water from a low solute to a high solute. So what happens if we open this membrane, right? So if we were to make holes, oops, that is a pretty big hole. But what you can actually imagine is that there's a couple holes in here now, but that these solutes are too big, they wouldn't be able to fit through. So these parts, these brown dots, which are the solute, they can't fit through, only water can pass. So what will happen is water will actually go from this side, because it's going to go from low solute to high solute, going to go from this end to this end. It's going to be more water on this end. So it's going to less water, so water travels, this water is going to be gone, parts of it is going to be gone, and it's going to travel to the other side. There's going to be more water on this side, right? So that's the whole idea of osmosis. You have water traveling from a low solute to a high solute. In this case, it was twice as much solute on one side than the other side. So you had water going from this end to the other end, right? So the reason why I bring up osmosis is because osmosis is important when it comes to how water enters the root. So the first part of the plant, the root itself, right here. So first what we do is we might have actually equal amounts of solute. So let's say we have 2 molecules of salt in the soil. It says pink was the soil, and 2 molecules of salt in the soil and the root itself. But what happens is we actively pump one of them into our root, right? So one of them will go from our soil into our root, and now we have 3 in the root and 1 in the soil. So that was through active transport. So we did that through active transport. So that cost ATP. And what that means now is we have more solid inside than outside. And that means that water will actually go from the soil into the root. So there'll be water in the root, right? That's the very first part of how water gets into a plant, is through more solute being in the root than in the soil for active transport. So active pumping, so you've got here active uptake of salts. Active uptake of salts means that water will go passively. So the reason why osmotic uptake of water will happen is because now we have more solute inside the root than in the soil. Now we have water in the soil, in the root. But the next step is, how do we get water into our up through our actual plant? So what I've drawn here is, I've got a picture of this. This is a xylem vessel. Remember, xylem was responsible for water transport. Now you can imagine, if you have a plant, you have to go up against gravity. So the direction would be up, and it has to go up against gravity. But the funny thing is, it actually requires no energy. So water travels without energy, even though it has to go up against gravity. And the way that works is, if you can imagine there were no way, so if these were water molecules going up against gravity, you can imagine as these guys being stuck in the air. So if there were nothing to hold them in place, they would simply drop down again, right? So they would be going down, even like they wouldn't be going up, they would just be dropping down. So these water molecules, if there were nothing to hold them, would just be dropping down. So you can imagine if they were trying to get up the xylem vessel, a xylem tube, it wouldn't happen because there'd be nothing to hold them in place, and gravity would pull them back down again. But the reason why that doesn't happen is because of something called adhesion and cohesion. So again, imagine these same water molecules here. So these blue dots are the water molecules, but they are connected. So they're connected by something called cohesion. Cohesion is water molecules attached to each other. So you can imagine these white stripes here. It's kind of like you have a harness which connects all of these these water molecules. You've got a harness which connects all these water molecules. And you can imagine these red dots, which is called adhesion. Adhesion is water molecules attached to xylem tube or attached to something else. So in this case, you've got the water molecules also attaching to the xylem tube right here. So like you can have the analogy of a rock climber. So he's going to hang on to the rock itself, to the wall, to the mountain. That's like hanging on to the actual xylem tube. And his harness is like cohesion, like hanging on to each other. So the reason why he doesn't fall is because he's got a harness and because he's holding on to the rock. Same reason why water molecules don't actually drop down. Even though there's gravity, they're holding on to the actual tube and they're holding on to each other, so they're not really falling down. That's the first important step to know why water transport actually works, how they can go up against gravity. And another point was this. So I'm going to have a quick summary of what we've done so far. So first we said that there's an active uptake of salts in the roots, so right here. That was the active uptake of salts. And the reason why that's important is if we have more solute in the root than in the soil, all the water will pass from the root, from the soil into the root. Right, so that's the first step. So now we have water being in the root here. So water is in the root. And how we get it up is they're kind of climbing. So they're climbing for these two different forces. I wrote on adhesion. That was when the water molecules attached to the xylem tube. And we've got cohesion. And that was when water molecules attach to each other. So those two forces allow water to kind of hang on and cling on to the actual surface or the areas of the tube. Now this is the most important part. This is when we're all the way up, when we have water molecules entering the leaf. This is what I've drawn here from just the stem into the leaf. And again, they've got the white and the red connections because they've got the cohesion and the adhesion happening. And what happens here is the word stomata hopefully will be familiar to you guys, but the word stomata is that opening. So there is an opening in the leaf where you can have gases escaping or water molecules escaping. And this opening means that these water molecules can actually kind of escape, they can evaporate. And when water molecules evaporate in plants, we call it transpiration, right? So that word transpiration is also important. That's the evaporation of water molecules. So these two here, have basically evaporated. But because they're all attached by a harness, so you have these harnesses here, you can imagine if these two evaporate, they're kind of going to pull. They're going to pull on the other ones. So if these two evaporate and they leave, they're going to pull on all the other ones. So you're actually going to pull every single water molecule up. So from here, from here, from here, from the root, from the stem, all the way to leaf, it's going to be pulling them up. And that's why it's called transpiration of pull. The whole process is called transpiration of pull. And the reason why is because you have evaporation or transpiration, which actually pulls these water molecules along. So we have water entering the leaf. So I'll summarize everything again. We have water entering the roots through osmosis. And from osmosis, it's going to go from the roots all the way to the leaf because of something called transpirational pull, right? So make sure to remember this word transpirational pull. And it's called transpirational pull because whilst the water molecules which are all the way on the surface of the leaf are going to evaporate, that's going to pull all the other ones along. And it's going to make sure that water is coming in a continuous stream, right? So when we lose some, we have more ones coming back up because they're going to be pulled up from the ones that have evaporated. So we get a continuous pull of water. And that's how this works because water is transported passively in xylem. So it's going up against gravity, but it doesn't require energy, and that's the reason why. So hopefully that made a bit of sense.
How do water and minerals get to the leaves? Although roots can exert a slight upward pressure, it is evaporation of water from leaves, a process called transpiration, that moves water molecules and ions up from the roots. Transpiration exerts a pull that is relayed downward along a string of water molecules from leaf to root.
So this is the second part. The first part we covered xylem. So xylem was the transport of water, and from the roots to the tip of the leaf, and that happened for a process called transpiration of pull. So make sure you remember that one. Now we're going to talk about phloem, and phloem is all about the transport of sugar or transport of glucose in the actual plant itself. So I'll go for this now. Transport of glucose. So Right here we have a picture, or we have the equation of photosynthesis. So you might remember from year 11, photosynthesis was all about carbon dioxide coming together with water to form glucose and oxygen. But the glucose is the reason why we're obviously covering this, because phloem transports glucose. And all this happens in leaves, right? So leaves are quite important because they produce all that glucose. So you need to know two terms. You need to know a source, which is the area of the plant that produces glucose. So as I mentioned earlier, it's actually the leaves that produce glucose. So the source of plants is the leaf. That's where we produce our glucose. And the sink is the area of a plant that needs glucose. So you can look at that picture. We've got the stem, we have the root. All of these parts are parts that still need to have glucose, but they can't produce themselves. So we've got, for the sink, we've got stuff like stem and the root. So all of these have cells too. And if you remember again, this is cellular respiration. It doesn't only happen in animals, it also happens in plants. Cellular respiration is glucose plus oxygen going into CO2, water, and ATP, and then we need to have that ATP for all kinds of things, and all cells need ATP, right? So that's why we need to make sure we get glucose from our leaves to the rest of the body, or right, the rest of the plant's body, right? So glucose is not only needed in the leaf, but it's also needed in the root and in the stem, but they're not going to produce it themselves, they can't produce it, so they need to get it. So sinks are the stem and the root, the parts that need glucose, and source is the part that produces glucose. So remember those, I'll go through those terms again, but remember them as well. So this is actually how it's happened. So we have, here you have a picture. Labeled number 1 is glucose is actively pumped from source, so where it's produced, into the phloem. So if you look at here, this is the source right here. So you can imagine this is the leaf right there, where it's produced. And the reason why it's actively, so it says the word actively, the reason why it says actively is because if you look here, there's maybe 5 or 6, 7 glucose molecules here, these orange dots, whereas there's a lot more there. And that's not going to happen by itself. That's not diffusion. Diffusion is from high concentration to low concentration. That has to be actively pumped. So again, I've got the same picture here. You can see I've got 3 here, maybe a zillion here, but we still want to make sure we get that glucose into the phloem. So the P stands for phloem, S stands for source, and what we're doing is we're going to actively pump even those remaining 3 from here into our phloem. All right, so that's the first step. That's number 1, label number 1. Glucose is actively pumped from source into phloem. The second step was water enters phloem via osmosis. If you remember, osmosis is from a low solute to a high solute concentration, right? If you look at this actual xylem, there's very little sugar in here, whereas lots of sugar in there. So you're going to have much of that water traveling from the xylem, which is right next to the phloem. So xylem here, phloem there, right next to each other. You're going to have that traveling in the other way. What you can imagine is you're going to have lots of water molecules and lots of sugar molecules all in a tight space. So you're going to have a huge pressure. You're going to have pressure buildup, right? So the second point was what's happening here. Water enters phloem via osmosis. But the third point, that high pressure buildup, because now there's so much in that phloem tube, that high pressure buildup makes glucose travel to sink. It's always going to travel from high pressure to low pressure. So if you look at this diagram again, you have high pressure here, and it's going to flow all the way down to a low pressure area. And a low pressure area happens to usually be, so like this area here, happens to be the area where we have sink cells. So high pressure makes glucose travel to sink cells. So now it's traveled from our leaf all the way to a stem and to a root. And good thing is now we can actually actively pump all that. So fourth step, last step, was glucose is unloaded into sink cells. So now we actually get our glucose from here, from the phloem tube, into our sink cell. And now our sink cell also has glucose, and that means that it can perform cellular respiration as well. So remember, we need to have glucose. All cells need to have glucose to produce energy. There's 2 words you need to remember. Source is area that produces the plant, the area of a plant that produces glucose. Sink is the area of a plant that needs glucose. Source is usually a leaf, and sink is usually a stem or root. The way it happens is glucose is first actively pumped from the leaf into the phloem tube. From there, water enters phloem via osmosis, so through xylem from next door. So now we have a third step is we've got the water and the sugar all in our tube, which means we've got lots of pressure. So that pressure is going to make sure it's going to go from high pressure area into low pressure area. And low pressure area is right next to our sink. So the fourth step is once it's at our sink, it's going to be unloaded into a sink cell. So it's going to go from our phloem into a sink cell, which means now our sink cells, or our root cells, or our stem cells, they all have glucose as well. They all have sugar. So, and the process of the word, because you need to know this word, is called translocation. If you look at the word, you can break it into two parts. Trans means different, or going different, or transporting different, and location means just area where it's needed. So it's gone from one location to a different location. It's gone from a leaf location to a sink location. So remember this term, translocation. It's gone from one area to a different area. So hopefully that made sense.
Use nutrients such as sucrose in their leaves. These nutrients must then be transported to the rest of the shoot or to the root tips where growth occurs. The leaves are referred to as the source, and the shoot and root tips are referred to as the sink. A source is an organ that produces more sugars than it requires, and a sink is an organ that consumes sugars for its own growth and storage. There are two kinds of vascular conducting tissues in plants: xylem, which conducts water and dissolved minerals, and phloem, which conducts carbohydrates, mainly sucrose. The transport of sugars throughout the plant, called translocation, is carried out by phloem cells. Phloem cells are connected to one another end-to-end by sieve plates. These are perforated structures that create a direct connection between the cytoplasm of connected phloem cells. Phloem loading is the process whereby carbohydrates enter the sieve tubes at the source. As a result of phloem loading, a high concentration of sugar develops in phloem cells near the source. Phloem loading results in a lowered water potential compared with adjacent xylem cells, causing water to move from xylem to phloem by osmosis. This influx of water creates a high turgor pressure near the source and lower turgor pressure near the sink, causing the movement of water and sugar from the source to the sink. Sucrose is removed at the sink by various active transport mechanisms depending on the cell type. In some plant cells, a transport protein located in the membrane of a storage vacuole called a tonoplast transports sucrose from the sink cell's cytoplasm into the vacuole at the expense of ATP. This reduces the concentration of sucrose in the sink cell, which enhances the movement of sucrose from the phloem cells through the companion cells and into the sink cell. All these events produce a continuous flow of water from xylem to phloem and then back to xylem. Water leaving phloem in the root moves upward primarily due to transpiration, not due to water potential differences between xylem and phloem.